Thank you for the worship songs. I appreciate that this morning. They were very meaningful to me this morning. I appreciate that time of worship. And my wife couldn't be here this morning. Last time I was here, it's been a year and a half since I was here last. And she had responsibilities with kids' church this morning. So her and my daughter, that is their ministry. They love hanging out with the little kids. They spend a lot of time with preschoolers. And so that's where they're at today. Lots happened in the Davis family in the last year and a half. We have a new family member. My son got married. Married a beautiful young lady, godly young lady. They're very active in the church that they attend. Very thankful for that. And my daughter Rebecca is in her third year of college, studying to be a school teacher. And no idea why God has impressed me to say this morning, but I'll share the testimony about Rebecca. She has a chronic foot problem. And for 5 years, she was in pain every day. And nothing the doctors could do. And talk about frustrating when you're in a place where you feel like, God, why aren't you moving? I see this young lady that has all this potential. She's a brilliant student. She loves you. She's passionate about serving you. And she is living in pain every day. Frustrating. So last year about this time she come to us and said, Dad, I can't go any farther. I just can't take the pain anymore. So we went back to the original foot surgeon who said he couldn't really do much. They walked in the room. I wasn't there. They walked into his office in the exam room, and shortly after that the doctor come in and he goes, Rebecca, I can fix your foot now. He never even had to look at the CAT scan or the x-ray again. He just knew that he could fix it. And I'm thankful for that, because 5 years of just constant pain. She's having a few issues, but she has more good days than bad days now. And then our insurance would not pay for that surgery. They said, we'll not pay for it. And we tried to work through that, and amazingly, there was a lady at Akron Children's Hospital that said, hey, your daughter's a full-time college student. We have a program for her. And a $30,000 surgery we owe zero for. Yeah, that's the goodness of God. That's how God works. He gives us things that we don't even deserve or even merit. And he says, I've got you. And I'm thankful for that. So, next thing that's going on, back in November, and you can go to the slide of the concussion giver, wherever she's at. There she is. That's Bella. So after watching the Ohio State-Michigan game over Thanksgiving weekend, I was taking a nap, and crazy Bella decided to jump on the bed and hit me here in the head, and then my head hit back here. And I am recovering from a concussion. So that's why I asked for a stool today, so I would not be wobbly on you. So it's been a long couple months of recovering, and thankfully God is helping with that each day, and having more good days than bad days. But and we're kind of professionals at concussions at our house between the kids, so thankfully we know, unfortunately we know what to do. But so anyway, I want to get right in. I don't have a joke today, I'm sorry. All right, so here's a joke I sent to Pastor Eric, because thinking maybe he'd share it with you. I was driving down 71 to Columbus the other day in the rain, and I passed a Chevy Volt. It was shocking. Sorry, that's the best I can give. So, all right, so we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19, and when Eric told me the series you're going through is focus, I kind of laughed, because that's one of the things I struggle with right now, is staying focused. And so in honor of Pastor Eric, we have Hawaiian shirts, so I thought you might enjoy that. So my daughter helped put that together last night. But we're going to focus on the whisper today. And so very familiar passage in 1 Kings chapter 19. Let me give you some background, and then we'll kind of go from there. And Craig, if you don't mind to pass those out. Let me give you one caution on these. These are cups of sand. Do not open them until I tell you. Do not try to eat them. Somebody did that once, tried to eat it. They thought it was brown sugar. It is sand, so keep it closed, and you'll know what to do with that at the end. So background here, Elijah, the Tishbite, a prophet of God, comes onto the scene in 1 Kings 17, and he confronts King Ahab of Israel, and Ahab was more evil than any king before him, and he added to that evil when he took Jezebel as his wife. And I wonder why people don't name their kid Jezebel nowadays. I mean, she was a very evil person. That's why. She brought the worship of the false god Baal to Israel. The worship of Baal was very perverted and evil. And so Elijah, he confronts Ahab and tells him it's not going to rain. And then God shuts off the rain. And then God sends Elijah to the brook and supplies for him, and daily, he was provided bread and meat, and the brook dries up. And as we talked about last time I was here, if you remember, we talked about Elijah being sent to the widow woman and how the miracle was in what was left. And then in chapter 18, Elijah goes back. Mount Carmel showdown happens. The prophets of Baal show up, and really how they show how foolish it was to pray to a false god. God answers Elijah's prayer by fire and consumes the offering. And then Elijah kills the prophets of Baal. A great victory happened on Mount Carmel. So that's kind of just some background. Then we get to chapter 19. And then Ahab tells Jezebel what Elijah had done. And Jezebel sends a messenger to Elijah and tells him that she will kill him. All right? Jezebel swore by the same false gods that couldn't answer by fire that she would take Elijah's life and that he would be killed. And Elijah hears the threat, and there are some manuscripts that say that he actually saw the threat. So I'm not sure what he saw, but he heard it, possibly saw the threat. And then Elijah, the man that prayed and the rain stopped, and then prayed again and it started. Elijah, the man that prayed and raised the widow's son to life. Elijah, the man that prayed fire down from heaven. Elijah, the man that put to death the prophets of Baal, is now afraid and running away. And that's where we pick up in chapter 19. And a question that comes to me is why? What happened? So let me read just a few verses and then we'll get into some of that. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and he ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. While he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush and sat down under it and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night, and the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So Elijah was faced with something. And he was faced with the roar of Jezebel. And have you ever had things in life just roar at you? And let me give you the definition of a roar. A loud, continuous, deep, confused sound. That is one definition. A loud, deep, prolonged sound or cry as a person in a rage. A loud, deep cry of an animal. So anybody in here, can anybody do a good roar? Anybody have one? Anybody? Go ahead. Oh, they're pointing at you. They're all pointing at you. They're all pointing. Come on, give me the roar. Come on. You can't do it? I'd love to hear it. But this roar, I mean, just imagine an animal roar. I mean, imagine you're at the zoo and you hear the lion roar. A roar is taking place, and the first thing that Elijah is faced with, he's faced with the roar of Jezebel. And it was one thing to confront Ahab, but Jezebel sent a personal threat to Elijah. And Jezebel was very evil, and it was her way of life to bring confusion and disorder, turmoil, and evil to everything she was involved in. And up until that point, it seems that Elijah has only dealt with and interacted with Ahab. But now Jezebel is roaring at him. And Jezebel was like right in his face, saying, I'm going to kill you. And have you ever had, guys especially, have you ever had anybody get in your face? It messes with you. Because now you're no longer in a friendly conversation. You're thinking it's either time to fight or flee. Those are the two things that will go through your head. And so Elijah's got Jezebel in his face. And not only did she get in his face, she became very real to him because she got in his head. So the roar is now just, hey, not just Ahab being an evil king and Jezebel being off in the distance, but Jezebel is right in his face, sending word that I'm going to take your life. She was roaring at him. Sometimes when the thing we are battling gets in our face and roars, it can overwhelm our thoughts and our mind. I don't know if you've ever been there, where you're battling something and it's roaring at you, and then all of a sudden it starts affecting here. Jezebel roars, and Elijah's thoughts and actions are driven by the roar instead of him being directed by God. When our view of God gets blocked, and our enemy can get into our heads, and Jezebel swore by her gods, the same gods that couldn't answer by fire on Mount Carmel. Remember that. But she swore by her false gods that she was going to kill Elijah. And it messed him up. And he ran because Jezebel was in his head. And Jezebel consumed his vision and his thoughts. He's running from the roar. And then the next roar that he's running from, and you can go to the next slide if you don't mind, is the roar of the movie in our mind. Now, how many, and I know I'm not the only one that has this, but you're living out life and you start thinking, life's going to be like this, things are going this way, and you start seeing this all playing out and kind of in your mind, you're laying out life. And I picture that with Elijah. He had to be to the place where he thought Mount Carmel was enough. It was a great victory. It was an awesome victory. God answered by fire and licked up the water and the stones. Think about that. The water was consumed. The stones were consumed. The offering was consumed. And yet now Elijah finds himself in the midst of another battle. So the movie in his mind had to be roaring. And I'm convinced, you ever plan an event and you have it in your head how you think something's going to go, and then it gets all messed up? Typically, people around us don't even know that things are messed up, but we do because we have it in our head, and we can be at the greatest event ever, and in our head, it's a horrible event because things didn't go exactly as we had them planned. But the same thing happens to us when we're battling things. We have it in our head that certainly Mount Carmel would be enough. to solve this. Certainly, my son having a concussion like he did a few years ago should have been enough for us not to have facing another one. That should have been enough. But I'm in the midst of another one. I've never had one until now, and I don't like it. But sometimes we have these movies in our minds, and that certainly this is how it's going to be. And when the Mount Carmel victories in the movie in our mind don't match up to reality, then it roars at us. Then the roar continues. So Jezebel's roaring at him. And now the movie in his mind is roaring at him. And the roar tells us that God has let us down. The roar would tell us that it is our fault. We must have done something wrong, certainly. The roar of the movie in our mind will make us feel guilty because things didn't go as we had thought. When Mount Carmel is not enough and our movie doesn't fit what we think, and God has something different planned, we can allow the roar to take place in our mind. And I think that Elijah was not only had the movie in his mind, but I believe he had to be physically and mentally wore out. I mean, think about it. There were the prophets of Baal, hundreds of them that he had executed. That in itself would have to be mentally and physically exhausting. He had journeyed through for the 3 years when it didn't rain. He had to be mentally and physically exhausted. Certainly Mount Carmel would have been enough. But God had other plans. And that's when the movie in our mind will kick in and it will roar at us saying, certainly you're the problem. Certainly you're the reason why things aren't going like they should. So we have the roar of Jezebel, we have the roar of the movie. And then we see it very clearly. Elijah faced the roar of fear. The exhaustion may have played in. All of these things may have magnified and brought Elijah to the place he was at, where he was afraid. Fear and anxiety all intensify by things that Elijah faced. And let me tell you, fear and anxiety will roar. I don't know if anybody in here deals with fear or anxiety, but I tell you, it can roar. In Exodus, the children of Israel became afraid at the Red Sea, and they wanted to go back to being slaves in Egypt because they were afraid. They didn't see how they were going to be delivered past the Red Sea. The roar of fear will take our breath away. Fear can overwhelm us so that no clear thought can penetrate our minds. Fear causes us to forget what we have seen God do in the past. Fear causes us to see no way out. Elijah prayed that God would take his life because he was afraid. And our family walked through, this was 4 years ago, we walked through a very difficult battle. And thank God for friends like Craig and other ones that helped me personally, my battle that I was facing during that. And prayed for me and helped me walk through it. But anxiety consumed me. It roared really loud in my life because of the situation we were walking through. And it seemed like every time we got a moment of peace in this battle that we were facing, the phone would ring and it would just suck that peace away from you. The battle wasn't stopping. And I have a pastor friend down in Columbus, and one day I called him and I said, Lou, I don't think I can go any further. And he says, you can't quit. But the anxiety and the fear and the roar was wanting me to quit. He says, you got to lead your family. You've got to keep moving forward, one foot in front of the other. And he would remind me of those things, that God has not forsaken you. But the roar was loud in my mind. And then one day, I was driving with my son. We'd been at a meeting. And it dawned on me that I have history with God. That He's done things in the past when I was at my worst, He brought me out of sin. That's enough for me to know that He's in control. We need to remember our history, because fear and anxiety will destroy us. It gets so loud in our thinking and our minds. Fear roars and distorts the truth. And Elijah knew what God had done for him. Elijah knew the things that he had seen. He prayed and it quit raining. He prayed again and then it rained. I mean, that's incredible. And then he prayed over the widow woman's son and God raised him back. God provided, but fear depletes life. We are not given a spirit of fear, but we are given a spirit of power. And I've got a few verses, so if we could grab Proverbs, the first one I think is Proverbs, if I remember right. That's all right. It's okay if it won't load. It talks about anxiety weighs us down, weighs down the heart. In Philippians 4, verses 6 through 7, and I'll read those so we can get that, because that's a recipe for us to overcome fear and anxiety. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And then 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control." So we need to remember that when the fear and the anxiety is roaring, that we don't have to live in that. God doesn't give us that. But Elijah is being driven by the fear of Jezebel. And you can see it's depleting his life. It's sucking everything out of him. He's afraid. And he says, God, just take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And the next slide is Elijah falls asleep under the bush. And the next point is, who baked the bread? See, in the midst of the roar, God's still taking care of us. And the roar that we are facing causes us to forget what God has done in the past and what He is doing now. Elijah ran away and leaves his servant, and he goes another day's journey into the wilderness, and he lands under a broom bush, and he prays for God to take his life. He falls asleep, and then an angel touches him and tells him to get up and eat. And the question is, who baked the bread? Who woke him up? See, God was with him. Even in the midst of the roar, when the roar was so loud that he was running away, God was still there. And bread should have been a great reminder to Elijah how God had provided for him in the past. And now there's an angel that touched him and spoke to him. When the roar is loud, fear and anxiety and even depression can cause our lives and our minds to get cluttered. But thank God He reminds us that He cares for us. He's still baking the bread. He's still providing for us. We may be walking through things that are difficult, but God is still providing for us. And He's with us. He's still baking the bread. God has not moved off His throne. He is still baking bread and providing to us when all we see is the roar of our battle. When our resources are not enough, God is still baking bread. God has not, nor ever will, abandon us. He's with us. He's still baking bread. So Elijah eats the bread, and then he journeys for 40 days, 40 nights on the strength of that bread. And then he comes to the Mount of Horeb, about a 200-mile journey. So the best I could tell by my trusty GPS, Columbus is 116 miles from here. So that tells you about how far 200 miles is. So might as well say to Columbus and back. That's how far he ran. He runs to Mount Horeb, known as the Mount of God. And some commentators think that he may have went to the cleft in the rock that Moses was at when God passed by. Elijah was running from his life and ended up in a cave, is where he ended up. You know, the reality is we can't run from our lives. We can run for our lives, but we can't run from our lives. Because the reality is when we run from our lives, guess what? We're still there. It's still following us. You know, so he ends up in a cave. So when you think about a cave, what do you think of? Anybody? Dark. That's the first one on my list. Yep. It's dark. You know why? Because I don't like the dark. That's why it's first on my list. Caves are cold and damp usually. Caves block the view of God because it's so dark. We can't see what's going on around us. And in the darkness, the roar echoes through the cave. The cave may seem like an end. Verse 9, let's see what it says there. Then he went into the cave and spent the night, and the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus, which when you get there, anoint Hazael king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel to succeed you as prophet." Let me skip on down. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, also whose knees have not bowed to Baal, whose mouths have not kissed him." So God knows where we're at, even when we land in the cave. The cave is echoing, it's magnifying the roar that is going on, but God knew exactly where Elijah was. And God was interested enough in Elijah, though things were roaring in Elijah's life. God was still interested. God calls Elijah out of the cave, and we must step out away from the thing that only magnifies the roar and step toward God. There was wind, there was an earthquake, and there was a fire. And this is a sad joke, but how many are old enough to remember Earth, Wind, and Fire? Okay, a few. A little before my time. And then I thought, if Elijah had a horse with no name, that would just like sum up a 70s mix, you know? Sorry. It's very sad, I know. But but you have the wind, you have the fire, you have the earthquake. The roar will never be louder than the gentle whisper of God. And notice how God spoke to Elijah. He whispered to him. And we need to focus on the whisper. When someone speaks in a whisper, we have to get close to them to hear. We have to lean in to hear them. God whispered so that Elijah would have to lean into him and hear. Elijah covered his face because he knew he was in the presence of God. We need to focus on the whisper because God speaks in the whisper. Want miracles And we want to see our prayers answered. And you guys, like our church has been in 21 days of fasting and prayer. And we want to see those things answered. We want to see God move in those things and do those great miracles. I have loved ones. I want to see them come to Christ. But what if in the midst of this time of prayer and fasting, God is saying, I want to change you as well? What if He's whispering that to you and saying, I want to change you? My encouragement is that we all lean in to the whisper today. That we all hear what He has to say for us. We must lean into the whisper so that we can hear God. If all we had was miracles and there was no change in us, I believe we've missed what God has for us. We need to lean in to the whisper. So here are some things you'll find in the whisper. We will find that God is closer than we thought. He wants us to lean in. God is not mad at us. When we lean into the whisper, we'll find that out. The roar says all of these things, but in the whisper, we find that God is not mad at us. We'll find out that God has a plan for us. Just like He did for Elijah. Elijah, go back the way you came and anoint this person to be king, anoint this person. And oh, by the way, I have 7,000 people that have not bowed a knee to Baal nor kissed him. Elijah, I have a plan. Elijah found that in the whisper. So you have the sand, and we'll get to that in a minute. But here's what I want you to know about the whisper. The same voice in the whisper is the same voice that said, let there be light. And I picture when God said, let there be light, I picture it as a thunder that was out there. And yet He's close enough. He wants me to lean in. In that same voice, He whispers to us. He whispered to Elijah. And when we look in the whisper and we lean into the whisper, we find that there is another in the fire. We're not there by ourselves. When we lean into the whisper, we find that there's another one holding back the sea. The waves that want to crash over us, the waves that want to roar over us, we have one that is saying, no, He's holding it back. And in the whisper, we find power to do what God has called us to do. Elijah not only was there to get rid of the roar, but he was there to be empowered, I'm convinced. In the whisper, we are reminded that there is no greater need than our salvation. See, when I was an 8-year-old boy, the gospel message was preached, and I realized that I needed a Savior. The Holy Spirit whispered to my heart. God spoke to my heart. He says, I want you to be my child. In the whisper, we are reminded of our salvation. In the whisper, we're reminded that there is an empty tomb and a resurrected Savior. We need to remember that, because that is our victory. We do not walk in this alone. We are not a defeated people. And the whisper reminds us of that. The roar says we're all of this, or you're going to be destroyed, but the whisper says, lean in. I've got more for you. In the whisper, we find that God will move heaven and earth for us. In the whisper, we find our brokenness is not permanent, but a making of a masterpiece by the Master. God whispers and says, move forward, I have you. God whispers, and the fight is not done, but you are not alone. See, Elijah had to go back. There was more for him to do. Even though it was kind of the beginning of the end for Elijah, he would be carried off into heaven after a little bit. But there was still more for him to do. No idea why, but if there's someone, maybe you think you're to a point in your life, there's nothing for you to do. God's not done with you yet. Don't give up. Don't. You may not feel good. You may feel too old, but remember, God can still use you. No matter what age, no matter where you're at in life, let God use you. God whispers, and we are reminded that He is a good God. God whispers so that we will draw to Him. And I'll give you a couple more. In the whisper, I am close. So that I can hear Him. In the whisper, I find peace. In the whisper, I will be reminded that He has started a good work in us, in me, and He will see it through to completion. In the whisper, we will not be cast away. We are being drawn closer. And in the whisper, I will be close to the one that touches the ones that nobody wants to be around. We find Him in the whisper. In the whisper, we will be changed. And I'm convinced that Elijah was changed from this experience. Lean into the whisper and listen to what God has for you. So here's where the sand comes in. And this is how we'll finish. And probably letting you out a lot sooner than Pastor Eric. So in the early 1970s, there was a guy by the name of Peter Jenkins that walked across America. Thousands of miles, through all kinds of things. Snowstorms and things in the desert. His dog, his companion that was with him, got hit by a car and got killed. Peter Jenkins got stabbed. And he was doing this as he walked across America. He went through a lot of things. And he wrote a book about it. But he was being interviewed one time, and they asked him, what was the one thing that almost made you quit? And the interviewer said he thought for sure it was going to be one of those big things. One of those things that happened to Peter Jenkins as he walked across America. He'd been robbed, he'd been stabbed, his dog got killed, Peter Jenkins got hit by a car. All these things happen. And certainly that would be it. Peter Jenkins goes on to say, the one thing that almost made him quit was sand in his shoes. You ever had sand in your shoes? It'll tear you up. Do you know what the sand does? It roars at you. It's so minute, but yet it roars really loudly. So here's how I want us to end this, and I'll show you. I need that. Yeah, there you go. Do you have the bucket? Yeah. I should have. There you go. Perfect. So I'm going to set this up here. And as you guys may remember from last time, I'm an illustration guy. So what's roaring in your life is represented here. I want you to think about it. I want you to take time and think, is there something roaring in my life? Whatever that may be. And then when you think about that, I just want you to come and, as you're coming, talk to God about it. Say, God, I'm not going to carry this roar around anymore. I'm not going to let this tear me up and destroy me anymore. Because when we dump the roar out, here's what happens. If you look at the vessel, it becomes clear. That's what happens. You say, well, there's residue in there. I know. I get it. But we can start seeing clearly because we've laid the roar down and we're leaning into the whisper. And that's how I want to end this today. So whatever is roaring in your life, I encourage you to come and empty it out. And I know this will be okay. Craig, if you could come here and just, if somebody wants to pray, I know him, I trust him with my life. Pray with him. He's a good man. He'll pray with you. He won't lead you wrong. But what's roaring in your life today? So I'm just going to leave it at that. That's how we're going to end.